Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. This day, June 5, we'll be explaining why Scott Morrison's trip to the Solomon Islands has absolutely nothing to do with Chinese interests in the South Pacific. We'll look at a sudden eruption of ideas for Indigenous recognition and wonder why Trump slammed Mexico with new tariffs but not Australia. As always, we'll close with our Books and Cultures segment, and today our panellists will talk about a new biography of Jeremy Corbyn, some hard-hitting videos on the Murray-Darling water disaster, a paper on the strange history of how Canberra came to be where it is, and Chris Berg will review a book on how to defend a siege, which for some reason has piqued his interest. So, speaking of Dr. Berg, welcome to Looking Forward.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be back.
Great to have you, my co-host, of course. And now also Gideon Rosner, our Director of Policy at the IPA.
Always good to be on Looking Forward, Scott.
Thank you for being here, Gideon. And IPA Research Fellow, Dr. Zach Gorman.
Good morning.
Great to have you back, Zach. Don't forget, this podcast is brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a supporter, please do go to ipa.org.au and see how you can join or donate to support our research and our many great digital products. In fact, our end of financial year appeal is in full swing. If you don't like paying tax, and let's face it, who does? This is your chance to send a sling our way and reduce your taxable income. Talk to your accountant and see just how much of your hard-earned you can send towards the IPA. Now it is time for that debate and discussion. First up, Chris Berg. There has been a flurry of stories about Indigenous recognition.
There has been. So Ken Wyatt, of course, was announced as the first Indigenous minister to hold the Indigenous Affairs portfolio under the new Morrison ministry. And very shortly after that, we are now once again debating Indigenous recognition. The Courier Mail has some draft plans that we haven't seen, but the Courier Mail seems to have, about a new Indigenous-led bureaucracy. There's draft legislation about that would review government policies, activate task forces, probe complaints about agencies from empowered communities. That's a quote. And it would inform itself on any matter in any way it thinks fit. This looks very much like a sort of new version of ATSIC, which of course the Howard government had originally imposed and ultimately abolished. But this is not a constitutional body as far as we know at the moment, but it comes in the light of really renewed debate about constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. The question that I have for the panel, but I'll start with you, Gideon, is there was two major political platforms at the last election. The Labor Party wanted to move ahead with Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. The Coalition did not want to do so. Why is it suddenly an issue now?
I think it's a case of the Coalition, as usual, or as has been its habit, of winning the economic debate, but letting the cultural debate go through to the keeper. The Coalition has not historically, or in recent history, been able to stand up to at the very least, the softer elements of the woke industrial complex. So when you have, a few people in the Liberal Party room, in fact, who favour constitutional recognition, when you have stakeholders who think that, who are wedded to the idea of constitutional recognition, government departments, academics, this is the Liberal Party going along with the softer elements of the cultural zeitgeist.
Is this proposal really part of that, and should we be concerned about this new Indigenous-led body? Because it strikes me that ATSIC had some serious problems, and as a bureaucracy, it's not the sort of thing I would support. But it's certainly very, very different from a constitutional change that would add a third chamber of parliament or even a constitutional advisory body or whatever the structures that are being discussed at the moment. Zach, what should we be worried about this?
Well, it depends if you take a sort of defeatist attitude to the Liberal Party. So if there's so much momentum...
Which I absolutely do, to be clear.
I know you do.
We're optimists of the RPA.
If there's so much momentum building towards some sort of Indigenous recognition, Indigenous voice, these sorts of things, we've got to hope that a Liberal Party will at least steer it down avenues that aren't as pernicious to freedom as the Labor Party might have. Obviously, we would hope that a Liberal Party would actually be classically liberal and wouldn't want to divide people up based on identity politics and based on race. But maybe in the political realities, something that can be abolished again, like ATSIC was, if it does prove to be as much of a failure as ATSIC, is not as bad as some big constitutional thing that we then can't get rid of.
Yeah, it certainly will require a degree of adeptness. But there's so many different dynamics at play here, and yeah, the Liberal Party has reasonably been on the bus for reconciliation for a long time, and the phrase recognition was originally proposals to do that, to recognise the prior occupation of the continent somehow in the Constitution. But of course, ever since the Uluru Statement, it's been clear that Indigenous politics has moved well past that, and I think probably there's still a slingshot effect of all those stakeholders that Gideon was just talking about who were expecting a comfortable Labor victory and were just ready to come out and map out the plan for the stampede towards the referendum. So they're still trying to work out how they can keep those ideas in play while the Liberal Party has to figure out, well, how much can it accommodate? How interested is it? What would this sort of son of ATSIC look like, which wasn't even talked about before the election?
But I have a lot of sympathy with the Indigenous supporters of these proposals because the big problem in the Indigenous recognition debate was always the fact that white Australia wanted to do one thing to the Constitution that was deeply symbolic. So they wanted to put in preambles, they wanted to clear off bad, but redundant sections of the Constitution that mentioned race and so forth. And quite rightly, people in Indigenous communities looked at it and said, well, that this is just symbolic changes. This is the mission of completing the Constitution is a symbolic task, and that doesn't really affect either material conditions on the ground in Indigenous communities or a sense of control and empowerment. And what they're doing now is looking for that sense of control and empowerment.
Well, what they based on the Courier Mail story, what they're actually going forward with will please nobody, because the Uluru Statement, as I understand it, asks for something in the Constitution. There's no talk of a referendum being triggered to implement this body. But in addition to that, there's no suggestion in the Courier Mail piece that this body would have any powers to actually oversee any funding, and that's where ATSIC really went wrong, because there were a long string of allegations of mismanagement of money and so on. So all that we're really talking about, I think, we're yet to see the details, is another consultative body. I don't think that same constituency, Chris, will be happy with that either. To me, it seems like sort of a halfway compromise.
Yeah, no, it is a halfway compromise, but it's a halfway compromise that at the very least tackles what clearly some people in the Indigenous community feel. So Megan Davis, so she's an academic from University of New South Wales, and she's been involved in the Uluru Statement and lots of Indigenous recognition politics for a long time. She made a really interesting point the other day on a Fairfax or a Nine Network podcast, which is pointing out that some of the changes that have occurred over the last few years in Indigenous policy have had the effect of removing control or removing stakeholders from the Indigenous community and moving money away from Indigenous groups to corporate reconciliation plans. So they've taken money out of small Indigenous community groups and given it to woke capitalism. And that was an Abbott government policy. And you understand why the Abbott government wanted to do that, because they were pushing really, really hard for this symbolic, wouldn't it be nice to complete the Constitution, here's a preamble type stuff. And they just funded it. And quite understandably, the Indigenous community, it's like, what on earth is going on? You're taking money away from there and giving it to the, quote, top end of town.
It doesn't surprise me, though. I mean, this isn't a new thing. Indigenous affairs in this country has been a tug of war between people who genuinely want to want to focus on the material disadvantage of Indigenous communities and the woke brigade who are fixated over symbolism. I think the national apology was the right thing to do, and I think it was a moment of catharsis for the nation, but it didn't lead to any miraculous improvements in a lot of Indigenous communities. We've spent every year talking about the date of Australia Day. We're talking about the national anthem now. There is this, and constitutional recognition would continue that same trajectory of meaning, symbolic, but in ultimately ineffective solutions to
So
very real problems.
What's that about the national anthem?
Oh, so today is Wednesday, which means it's State of Origin Day, and there's a big protest going on.
What's that? Netball? No.
It's the great
Hockey?
New South Wales sport of NSWRL.
Of course.
I'm happy to go back to the VFL and the NSWRL, and separation. The greater the separation, the greater the federation.
State of Origin. I tell you what, when I was working up in Canberra, every time that asinine spectacle came on, it was like everybody just took the time off and everything. I couldn't stand it.
We are seriously cutting into our potential listeners.
So there was
That's why we got Zach here.
a number of Indigenous players on both sides have said that they're not going to sing the national anthem because they feel that the national anthem does not represent them, and it's not the overall narrative of the national anthem. It's one particular line about we are young and free, and they feel as one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuous culture in the world, that doesn't really represent them. And Craig Kelly, quite surprisingly, has come out and supported them. So Craig Kelly, the quite conservative member for Hughes, who's normally thought of as the sort of hard right of the Liberal Party, has said that if we make a minor change, like changing it to strong and free, that it's a bit more inclusive and these sorts of things.
Not inclusive of people who don't have physical strength.
I'm sort of sympathetic to this. I mean, we only adopted Advance Australia Fair as our national anthem in 1984. We already changed a few of the words.
And it is a shocking song.
We got rid of. I think it captures to a certain extent, as a historian, I see a lot of the aspirations of 19th century Australia, of this land of opportunity. I think that wealth for toil in particular, we should rip that out as the IPA and use that for our Dignity of Work program.
Here.
It's a song about, it's about boundless plains to share. It's about wealth for toil. If you work hard, you will get rewarded in Australia. And that was the 19th century idea of Australia, was this ideal of the self-made man, the ideal of people like Henry Parkes. So I have a lot of sympathy for that. But at the same time, getting rid of young and free is sort of getting rid of that sentiment anyway. So it's a bit of...
It is precisely the sort of thing that is going to be put up by a government very soon. Probably a conservative government that wants to make symbolic changes to some national icon, whether that is symbolic statements in the Constitution, whether it's the change to the national anthem or even a new national anthem, or whatever it is.
There'll be a flag debate before you know
There
it.
will be a flag debate.
Yep.
But whatever that debate does and whatever the outcome of that is, it's going to make no material difference to Indigenous lives, and it's going to make no material difference to Indigenous control over their lives. And so I think if we are to advance this discussion in a way that advances the prosperity of Indigenous people and the opportunity of Indigenous people in Australia, we need to be talking about, devolving powers back to Indigenous communities again, not fighting about it in Canberra.
I think symbolism really matters in issues like this, and that's why I think something like changing one particular line of the national anthem to make it more inclusive is a better way of going about it. One of my pet peeves with the way that Indigenous issues are tackled at the moment is that so much of it is about sort of separating Indigenous people from the rest of society, and I think that ultimately, long term, that's not going to produce the best outcomes. So if we change the way that we're talking about these sorts of things to be talking about how do we get Indigenous people to be more comfortable with being part of this Australian society, then economically and these other things down the track, I think will have flow and effect.
But, I mean, to what end though, Zach? I mean, as I said, that this is, whether it's changing the anthem, whether it's the national apology and everything else, wrongs have been committed in the past. We need to, as a nation, acknowledge our checkered history. We need to acknowledge that some of what is occurring in Indigenous communities today can be traced back to the wrongs that were committed in the past. But, we had the national apology, as I said, that great moment, that genuinely great moment of catharsis for our country. But in the 10 plus years since, what have we achieved? How much more can we go down this road of symbolism, which ultimately...
I think that's a sort of different type of symbolism. I would count the apology, for all its merits, as part of this narrative about Indigenous victimhood and how separate Indigenous people are from the rest of society. I certainly wouldn't endorse, for example, Indigenous constitutional recognition and these sorts of things that are about the separation. But the slight tweaking of the national anthem, the reason that I sort of support it and that Craig Kelly supports, people like Craig Kelly support it, is because it's about fostering that inclusivity that is what we really need, rather than that divisive identity politics.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when Whitlam put the national anthem on the table. I was a supporter of Waltzing Matilda because I thought having our national song being one about rustling sheep would have been quite appropriate and a better recognition of the 19th century ideals that you've been talking up, Zach, because I think that's much closer to what it was
Waltzing
actually like.
Matilda's grown on me over the years. I never used to like that song, but I think it'd be a much more iconic national anthem, I think, than Advance Australia Fair.
Right.
Yeah. That would solve everything. Let's make that change. Speaking of Aussie, our wonderful Prime Minister is in the UK. He and his missus have met with the Queen, but he stopped off on the way at the Solomon Islands. The very first visit as the newly re-elected Prime Minister was in the Solomon Islands, which has a population of 600,000 people. What's that about, Chris?
Scott Morrison, as you say, was in the Solomon Islands this week. He was announcing major new spending in the Solomon Islands, $250 million, very explicitly and very deliberately to stave off Belt and Road investments in China. This is a really interesting story because it's part of that geopolitical dynamic that we're facing right now. I was in Papua New Guinea late last year and talking to a number of Papua New Guineans. Of course, I was there to do some blockchain work, but talking to Papua New Guineans there, there's a massive amount of Chinese government spending in Papua New Guinea and a only tiny amount of Australian government spending. And the Papua New Guineans were trying to urge Australia to just pour more money in because they felt that with Chinese money came Chinese influence and Chinese control. Now, we are very uncomfortable with that sort of thing because from our perspective, it feels a little colonialist. It feels a little bit like the Australian government once again pouring resources into a foreign country to, particularly a small foreign country to its north, to gain some sort of influence and control and economic or political control. But that's what they were arguing. That's what they were asking us for, and that's what they are asking.
Well, I don't see it as so much colonialism. I see it as sort of a new Cold War mentality where there are two blocks and each block tries to get countries on side with percentages like that.
Are we in that environment, and should we respond in the same way that we did in the Cold War, where we sort of divide up the planet and put investments in one place?
Well, before Gideon answers that, you said that this was explicitly part of trying to get in front of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It wasn't explicit at all. Morrison's gone out of his way to say this has nothing to do with China. This is just helping out the Solomon Islands. This is just helping out Vanuatu or PNG or insert name of South Pacific country here. So that is one way in which it differs from the Cold War, because we're denying that there is any kind of great game afoot, even if there is.
It does appear they've very quietly briefed out that very aggressively.
And I think that's to do with the dynamic. I mean, there's no iron curtain here. There's no actual sort of two blocks squaring off. It's sort of almost a shadow boxing type dynamic.
We like China. They buy lots of our stuff.
Well, that's the other complexity as well. I mean, this is the frustrating thing about the China debate. There are people who think it's the great menace that we're all, have to really wise up and get tough on China and so on and so forth. Then there are people who say, no, free trade is wonderful. China buys our stuff. China's got literally billions of consumers for Australian beef. We shouldn't get them offside. I mean, I suspect the truth probably lies somewhere around the middle, but geopolitics isn't my forte.
Zach, what should we think about Belt and Road?
I just wonder about sort of the internal dynamics within the Chinese authoritarian regime that's sort of driving this. Because a lot of the Western world has really bought into these ideas of free trade and international diplomacy, and that sort of Cold War mentality is a bit past its use-by date, that it's no longer really necessary. We understand that if we're able to trade cheaply for goods, that's better than having to conquer a country directly or indirectly in order to obtain those goods. I think perhaps what's going on internally in China, and this is to draw an extremely long bow and just essentially speculate, But we see and we get frustrated as libertarians, as classical liberals, with the internal political dynamics of a democracy and how our political leaders always want to have something to do. Then this is why government continually expands, because they need to find a reason for their own existence. And I think dictatorial regimes are no different. What motivates them is different, and what avenues of sort of agitation they go down is different. But in order for the authoritarian regime to justify itself, it sort of needs an enemy. It sort of needs this expansionary view of the world. And I find that quite concerning and difficult to get my head around, because so much of the world has sort of outgrown it.
Even if that is the intention of the Chinese, and it may very well be, I think we should take a realistic look at how the Belt and Road Initiative is faring. I mean, countries that are asking for investment, like Papua New Guinea, are wising up to what's going on here. Now, the government in the Maldives was turfed out last year by a party running on expressly on an anti-Belt and Road platform because of concerns there. Mahathir Mohamad, who I don't agree with a lot of the time on many, many issues, to put it mildly. Just to clarify. The old, he's come out and publicly said that the Belt and Road Initiative is quite a form of new colonialism. Countries where Belt and Road projects have run into difficulty, partly because of suspicion of China, have occurred in places like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Burma, Nepal, Pakistan. Belt and Road projects are being held up because of anti-China, or at least suspicion of China there. I mean, these are not countries that can afford to look a gift horse in the mouth, but even they are questioning the wisdom of going in on these sort of endeavours. So with all of that in mind, is it worth Scott Morrison going to Honiara to pony up $250 million of our money simply for playing catch up? Well, I'm not sure.
I mean, he may well be doing. He may well have wanted to do so otherwise and just briefed quietly. Yeah. Oh, this isn't just foreign aid. This is a special geopolitical thing. Don't worry. Smarter people than me are in charge. But I think Zach's point is really significant, because the internal dynamics of Chinese politics are clearly driving a lot of the Belt and Road initiatives. And there's a lot of evidence that we've now got about how deeply dysfunctional this is as a government policy.
Correct.
And if I was a Chinese citizen, I would be furious about all this money being poured into very bad projects around the world for very uncertain purposes. And there's a lot of evidence about how it's deeply connected to internal local government corruption. Because, I mean, the thing about the Chinese state...
And it's a Xi Jinping pet project as well.
Well, it's a Xi Jinping pet project, but it's a pet project that he announces, and they give these big, grand policy statements or big, grand statements of directions that everyone should go. And then local and provincial authorities have to go and do it. And there's a huge gap between Beijing and the provincial authorities. And there's an enormous capacity for them to make rents, to corrupt practices, to enrich themselves, enrich their friends in business and so forth. And they're just exporting that model of political economy around the world. What has been very heartening is precisely, as you've said, Gideon, which is the political pushback in some of these democratic countries that are vulnerable. Like you can manipulate Cambodia because it's a dictatorship. It's much harder to manipulate a democratic country like that because you will get pushback from the citizens. But what's also very comforting about that, about it as well, is the Chinese government hasn't seemed to be using this as the debt trap that everybody's been concerned about, and they've been renegotiating many debts and restructuring many debts when some countries feel unable to pay. So it's not as obviously economic colonialism as your new mate.
Yes and no. I mean, the Sri Lankans did lose a port recently when China foreclosed. I think there's been concern that Kenya will lose its major port in Mombasa because of threat of foreclosure. But that's an interesting point, that it's not a uniform thing.
From an Australian perspective, I don't mind this as much as I otherwise would. So obviously, I hate taxpayer money just being burnt up in smoke. But the situation in Samoa was very specific because...
Solomon Islands.
Solomon Islands, sorry. The Pacific Islands. The situation in Solomon Islands was very specific because they're one of the few regimes in the region that recognizes an independent Taiwan. And it's specifically because of that the Chinese government is trying to heap pressure on them. So we're spending this money to essentially give them the economic backing to say that you can have independent political viewpoints in this region and you won't be sort of driven out of town for it. And I certainly, if you were to compare and contrast what the Morrison government is doing here with what the plans of the defunct Shorten government were, which was to just throw money at the UN pile and hope that it went somewhere for the good of mankind, I far prefer the direct impact standing up in the region and for people that we should directly care about because they are our neighbours.
Yeah, I do. I did. It's very well pointed out that, but I did find it sort of amusing that you've got the US and Australia saying to the Solomon Islands, you should keep the recognition of Taiwan because you shouldn't recognise China the way we did 50 years ago. I mean, Nixon and Whitlam actually took care of that in the 70s for us, but we're sort of saying to the Solomon Islands, no, stick with Taiwan because you shouldn't even have diplomatic relations. That's one irony. The other, of course, is we're building a submarine cable for the Solomon Islands to replace a contract that they had with Huawei. And this is one of the great issues of dealing with China, and we'll talk about tariffs in a minute. The Huawei solution actually would have been much better. So we're using taxpayers' money to replace a solution that the Solomon Islands could have had with Huawei, but which had other issues.
I feel like I'm missing something here. I mean, why do we care whether the Solomon Islands recognises Taiwan or not? And why does China care for that matter? It's not like they're a major world power or have any capacity to resist a Taiwanese independence movement or something.
It's obviously a threat to the Chinese government's vision of itself,
right? Okay,
and that's why this is deep with symbolism. And this week in China-Australia relationships has been deep with symbolism because there was it is the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. On the same day, we had Chinese warships visiting Sydney Harbour, which everybody reported was a surprise, but clearly not a surprise because, the Australian
Not
Navy...
surprising to the groups of Chinese Australians who were waiting at the wharf waving flags. Clearly WhatsApp had been working over time.
WeChat.
WeChat,
but this is right now a relationship deep with symbolism. You're right, the Huawei stuff and the Australian relationship with the Five Eyes group, and is the entire Five Eyes security compact going to ban Huawei or remove Huawei from their networks in the same way that we've been dealing with cryptography standards and so forth for a long time. This is a really challenging year in the China-West relationship.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, more sympathetic to Taiwanese independence I could not be, but does it justify $250 million? I don't know.
Yeah, I think status quo. Please don't shoot at each other, I think, is our preferred option.
Ideally.
Yes, very good. Now, I did promise that we would talk about tariffs because it takes two to have a trade war, and President Trump has been very active again, and not just in respect of China.
It does take two to make a trade war, and interestingly enough, this week is also the 1-year anniversary of the trade war. So happy birthday, trade war, given the 15%
And
tariffs.
Gideon's birthday.
And
shares
happy
a birthday
birthday, trade war, and Gideon.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Not in that order. So, of course, currently the United States has 15% tariffs on Chinese goods and is threatening, or on a large volume of Chinese goods and threatening to go up. But this week, or somewhat 5 days ago or so, Donald Trump announced that there was going to be a 5% tariff on all Mexican goods, every good coming across the border from Mexico to the United States, which would rise all the way up to 25% in October until the border is secure on the Mexican side. This is interesting in a lot of ways from an immigration policy perspective, from a tariff policy perspective, but from a just a sheer negotiating perspective, it's also quite bizarre given that at the very same time, both the Mexican and United States Congress are trying to pass the revised NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, through their own Congresses and trying to get political approval from that. And as you mentioned right at the start, Scott, there is some suggestion, and there was a New York Times article and some support for that they were also considering a tariff on Australia. So finally, the border between Australia and the United States would be closed. Making my job a lot easier. But what are we to make of this new surge, not just surge in tariffs from an economic perspective? It's not just protectionism here. It's tariffs as a political tool to try to get policy regime change in foreign countries.
Well, my first question is, why would he pick on Australia? I mean, it's not like Australia is taking American jobs. What company in the US decides to close down and move to Australia because it's cheaper to do business there? What do we have? Lower wages here? Do we have lower regulatory costs here? Do we have cheaper energy? So that's the first thing I'd sort of wonder.
We did once have cheaper energy.
Many moons ago.
Federal government's taking care of that. So we can say to Trump, don't need to worry there.
All sorted.
Yeah, correct. No competitive advantage there anymore. But look, I'm one of these people that loves Trump. I love, what he's done with red tape and with taxes. I even love what people don't love about Trump. I love the tweeting. I love the crudeness. I love the swagger. I love the authenticity. The one thing that always people like me come around to is trade. I do not like the protectionism. We all know trade wars are bad. We all know that free trade is good for everybody involved and good for humanity. So on these measures, I am, appalled by them as a matter of trade policy. As a matter of politics, I can understand the use of the US's trading heft as leverage to resolve what are some actual legitimate disputes, whether it be the dispute with Mexico over the border or whether it be genuine issues with the way China does business, like technology theft or heavy-handed regulation on tech and media companies in particular, or its huge subsidisation of its own industries. I think to get a better deal, I can meet Trump halfway and accept that whacking on a few tariffs temporarily to cause a bit of pain for the other side to get an outcome that's good for his country and good for his people. I can get behind that.
But aren't you wildly underplaying it? Because he's not whacking tariffs on other people. The people who pay the tariffs are not Chinese producers. They are American citizens, because tariffs are taxes. They are taxes levied on your own people. So this is an attack in the same way that a raised taxes would be an attack on American consumers to pursue geopolitical goals. Shouldn't that make you more outraged?
Look again. I don't like tariffs. I don't like trade wars. I'm a free trader to the bootstraps. But I think there are competing priorities here. I know that the real people who are hurt by tariffs are the consumers. You know that. I think on some level Donald Trump knows that. But I think that's maybe less important.
I don't think he does.
Well, he may or he may not. I'm not a mind reader. But the point is that that in the medium term at least is less important than getting his way with Mexico and solving that problem that he ran on, than solving issues with the Chinese. I think invoking a bit of pain. And since when have politicians been averse to inflicting pain on their own people through taxes?
Yeah, but you can't run China and Mexico together in the same argument. I mean, the tragedy for Mexico was this is a country that for a very, very long time was completely insular, protectionist, poor as a church mouse because of self-imposed stupidity. What was it? Run by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, I think, which is a wonderful, wonderful phrase. And NAFTA helped bring them out of that. And so this is selling down the river the liberals, the true liberals, in Mexico that have fought for years to say that free trade is good. Let's enmesh ourselves with the US economy. Let's open up to the world. Let's break down all these barriers. Let's get the state out of business. All the entrepreneurs in Mexico, which have just, some of them have clearly been too successful in organising themselves. It's not just, car companies relocating to Mexico. There's been a domestic upsurge, and it's just selling them down the river.
But what does Trump care about what Mexican economists think?
Well, but what about the geopolitics of having a southern neighbour? You can either have it poor, impoverished, protectionist, inward-looking, and dumb, or you can have one that's actually
Migrant producing.
yeah, exactly.
Well,
and
it does that already.
You want to stop migration, you make Mexico rich.
Yeah.
not
How's
poor.
that worked for the past 20 years?
No,
I mean,
but most of the caravans are coming up from Central and South America as well. It's I have
That's
a
true.
lot of
That's
sympathy with
true.
the Mexican government.
Zach, how do you feel? How do you feel about tariffs as a tool of geopolitics rather than
I
economics?
think that this is obviously Trump trying to take the art of the deal and sort of use international relations as business relations where you can sort of strong arm someone into doing things and all the rest of it. And we know that this is bad because tariffs hurt the consumers and tariffs hurt the people within the nation more than they hurt the people externally. But I think one of the real reasons that Trump has even been able to get away with this is that we think we've embraced free trade in the West, but we never really embraced free trade in the West. It's always been these multilateral and bilateral agreements with 1,000 attached terms and conditions.
Correct.
And it's only if it's reciprocal. True embracing of free trade accepts that free trade is good for your country, it's good for your economy, it's good for your consumers, even if the rest of the world spurns you. It's having that 19th century New South Wales optimism to stand up to Victoria and the rest of the country and
more
be
state
like,
of origin.
stuff you, we will open our trade barriers to the world and we'll be richer because of it. We've always looked at, in the late 20th century into the 21st century, we've looked through tariffs and free trade through this narrow lens that is one of the reasons that Trump is able to sort of spin things the way that he does.
I think that's right. I don't know why you had to make it personal, Zach. But one of the things that's always bugged me about the way we talk about free trade agreements in Australia, and I'm not as much of a skeptic of multilateral or even bilateral trade agreements as some are. But one of the things that really bugs me is when politicians sell this, particularly when the Abbott government was passing so many free trade agreements, which I thought was good.
3 in 2 years.
3 in 2 years.
Testament to Tony Abbott and how wonderful he was, and how he shouldn't have been rolled.
What really bugged me about that, Gideon, was the fact that when they sold these, it was only ever about opening up market access in foreign countries. It was never about the fact that we as consumers would be getting cheaper goods. We have a free trade agreement with Japan or with China or with the United States. That means the big benefit for us as citizens, as consumers, as people who live in a society, the big benefit from us is now we get cheaper access to foreign goods. That's where the benefit of free trade agreements come from. But the politics is obviously so distorted that they can't sell that. They have to sell, oh no, it's wonderful that a couple of beef producers get to get slightly cheaper access into Chinese markets. Yeah, good. That's really good for the beef producers and that's really good for Chinese citizens. But the benefit is what we get coming as imports.
Yeah, but politically, that's not a viable thing to be selling because the first thing that you then hear is, well, great, then central people in central Queensland will be out of a job and in manufacturing bases and so on. But I think that Zach raises a really, really important point, is that I think when we talk about Trump and trade, and Trump is admittedly bad on trade, but it's not like Trump is Robinson Crusoe. He did not interrupt some sort of free trade nirvana, this global sort of coming together. Zach's absolutely right. Every free trade agreement is riddled with carve-outs and exemptions and special favours and all sorts of other things. Tony Abbott, much as I love him, I love him almost as much as I love Trump, if not more. But Tony Abbott stood up at that wonderful victory in 2013 and said Australia is open for business. One of the first things his government did was override the Foreign Interest Review Board, the Foreign Investment Review Board's decision on GrainCorp on national security grounds. How is foreign ownership of an agribusiness company in any way a threat to national security?
It was a threat to the National Party.
Exactly.
That was the issue, Gideon, as you well know.
And we're one of the better people. We're one of the better countries when it comes to trade. You ever tried to do business with the EU? The bloc's set up partly to be this big protection. Trade is free within the EU, but partly they've been set up to create this big protections juggernaut. So I think all these for lack of a better way to put it, globalist types who sit around saying, oh, isn't Trump terrible? He's disrupting the wonderful free trade order that we have. He's disrupting the wonderful coming together of humanity. I'm sorry, the picture is not that rosy. It'll be a long time before we have genuine global free trade.
No, that's right. And one of the longer term perspective is useful because has been a marked increase in protectionism in the world since the global financial crisis. And there was a lot of attention tried to draw to this fact and tried to prevent countries from turning protectionist when the global economy turned poor. But unfortunately, for the most part, that was unsuccessful. And quite quickly after the global financial crisis, there were tariffs on cars and all the sectors that were under threat from the macroeconomic conditions as well. And so in that sense, you could say that the Trump era protectionism is just one of a kind with a trend. But my strong view is when we are talking about tariffs of 10%, 25% on Mexico, 5%, 10%, 25% on China, that is of a quantitatively significantly different thing.
Yeah, I think, well, and if you take the long view, it is actually deeply concerning because that was part of a world order that was established after World War II, the Bretton Woods agreements, the great institutions, originally the World Bank, the IMF, what became the World Trade Organization in due course. This was a global order imposed by the victors, it can be said, but it worked for 20 or 30 years, and then one by one, each of those institutions has failed. I mean, Nixon blew up the international currency agreements. The IMF is now a disgrace. The World Bank is a disgrace, and now the trade architecture is falling apart. So it's more than just the GFC. If you look at the long arc of history, it's all actually falling apart. I'm not saying I'm a globalist, but if you are, it's getting harder and harder to be one because its underpinnings are actually under deep threat.
I'm a globalist, but the big issue with the trade architecture was the inability for us to do multilateral trade agreements, and that inability has really lasted for the better part of 20 years now, and that's why we moved into these bilateral trade agreements. And it's created the opportunity for this politicization of free trade. I agree with Zach. What we really need to do is free trade in one country. Get rid of our tariffs and our protectionism.
Yeah, that's something the IPA can definitely get behind.
To do that as well, we need to make sure that the manufacturing has hit the wall in this country, and that's partly because of increased competition from overseas, but partly because we do everything we can to destroy manufacturing. We hike our energy prices, we hike our labour costs, we layer red tape on everything. We need to, the right and people who do believe in free trade, and despite me defending Trump, I'm one of them, we need to redirect the anger of people who genuinely are feeling the pinch of automation and losing their jobs and outsourcing and so on, and saying this is not because of free trade and of people in China or India or anywhere else. This is because your own government has failed you, because they have hog-tied your employer and made it impossible for them to operate in this country.
Well said, Gideon. We have come to that part of the show where we look at books and culture. We ask our panellists what they've been reading, watching, or listening to. Who would like to take us away?
I will have a go first, Scott. I read a novel. It's not a very political novel, but it's a novel called 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. It's by the British novelist Tom Holt. He's writing under the pseudonym of K.J. Parker. It's a very, it's a light an amusing novel. It's very opinionated about a main character called Orhan, who's an engineer who finds himself leading the defense of a fictional medieval city against an attacking force. It's very focused on engineering, of all things. It's a novel about engineering and about the engineering challenges of defeating against catapults and siege equipment.
Sounds like a real page turner.
It is. No, it is genuinely really fun and really great. And I wanted to talk about it because that's what I read this week. But I have come up with a political view about it. So this main character, Orhan, he becomes the leader of the city. He's just an engineer, and he's very self-deprecating. But the emperor is unwell or something along those lines, so he's functionally the emperor. And what he has to do is get the leading civil society organizations of the city to work together. And what the story that Holt paints is actually a rather interesting story about non-state civil society organisations coming together to coordinate a defence of a city. In the absence of, the emperor is functionally absent. There is no army. There is just groups of people who can cooperate under
Spontaneous order.
It's not quite a spontaneous order because he's ordering them around, so he is the spontaneity. But you don't have to read it for the politics. It is a just really fun novel.
But you did. You don't have to read it for the politics, but you somehow managed to do so.
I stretched a political story out of it.
Well done. Well done. So that story shares something with Zulu, the great movie with Michael Caine, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
That was the engineers who led the defence.
Yeah.
Because the army was being slaughtered somewhere else. Gideon.
So I am reading a book called Dangerous Hero, which is an unauthorised biography of Jeremy Corbyn, which, Scott, you plopped on my desk a few weeks ago and said asked me to review for the IPO review. So a great perk of this job.
I didn't give you any guidance as to your take on it either.
That's right. But one of the perks of this job is that people plop free books on your desk here and there. So that's really good. But look, I'm reading it. It's a very, very British style hatchet job. Very, very entertaining. But the upshot of it is relevantly that yes, Jeremy Corbyn really is that bad. Yes, he sympathises with IRA terrorists, even ones who blown up and killed his fellow British citizens. Yes, he is all friendly with all manner of extreme Islamic terrorist groups that even Lee Rhiannon wouldn't touch with a barge pole. Yes, he genuinely does want to nationalise the means of production, distribution and exchange. But here's the thing. He is actually a really, really... he's stupid. He is not an intelligent guy. No, but this is the thing. It's sort of his runaway success sometimes gives us the impression that he's some sort of political genius. He is... going back to it, right when he was a kid, he was the runt of the litter in the Corbyn family. He was the only one to not go to university because he couldn't. Nothing wrong with people who choose not to go to university, but tried as he might, he couldn't get in. He was sent off on some mission to Jamaica where he mixed with all manner of extremist independence movement people and things like that, and then came back to Britain and found his place in his calling in the world by stacking out Labor Party branches and playing internal games, almost like a student politician. But this is the thing, because he is of such low intellect, he's clung onto an ideology, an extreme Marxist ideology that he picked up somewhere in the 60s, which he doesn't have the intellectual prowess to understand. So he has this juvenile high school understanding of goodies versus baddies, where he will bang and scream and bang his fists about the Iraq War, with some justification in hindsight, we can all say, but will say nothing about, not even condemn, not even agree with the condemnation of Saddam Hussein for gassing Kurds, because somebody like a Saddam Hussein is a victim of terrible imperialism. He really is the lowest common denominator in left-wing thought, and to the extent that he will even say that privatising British Telecom was a bad idea. He wants to go back to the days when you had to wait 12 months to get a phone line installed. I mean, this is the kind of, for him it is about he's driven a lot by the fellow travellers he's picked up over the years, but it's always been this contest of, the left taking control of this council, the left taking control of this local party branch, the left taking control of the Labor Party, the hard left taking control of, stamping its authority on the Labor Party to make it into the Corbyn hard left Labor Party, and eventually, turning Britain into this socialist nirvana as well.
Is that the story of the book? So, from the outside, it does look like he's been actually remarkably successful, at least certainly holding power within the Labor Party. Obviously, Labor's not doing very well against the best efforts of the Conservatives. The Labor Party is not exactly in the advance. But how does the book explain what appears to be his longevity in the role?
Well, that's the fascinating thing. He sort of, it goes into the various leadership challenges as he's been under, the various threats that he's miraculously escaped from. And it's a combination of incompetence by the old Blairites in the Labor Party to blast him out, Theresa May's incompetence, which gave him a huge boost in the 2017 election, and also the internal party rules in the Labor Party, which he exploited. The fact that if you paid £3 or something, you could sign up as a Labor member, and the scale of what branch stacking by militant left. They make the CFMEU look like the IPA. There's some of these militant unions in the UK. That the scale of the stacking by them is really something quite extraordinary. So yeah, very very entertaining read.
And we do look forward to the review in the July edition of the IPA.
Just transcribe this, and Bob's your uncle.
There you go.
Save me writing it.
We'll send it off to rev.com to get it transcribed. No, well done, Gideon. I might go next. Everyone around this table, including our wonderful producer James Bolt, were at the recent Friedman Conference in Sydney, and during a breakout session I saw a wonderful video or series of videos by the libertarian artist and filmmaker Topher Field on the disaster of the Murray-Darling Basin Commission and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which is creating havoc through in farming communities right through the Murray-Darling Basin. It's a complex topic. We see things for those of us who are not close to it, who aren't relying on irrigation for a living, who don't hear the stories of the farmers every day, who don't have water allocations. It can seem complex. You see the ABC will run stories of fish kills in the Darling around the Menindee Lakes, and they'll blame climate change, or they'll blame this or that. These are wonderful videos available on Facebook. As I say, I saw them at the Friedman Conference, but they're on Facebook. This Topher Field is a legend at actually breaking down complex issues. He's recorded, he's shot all the way up and down the basin, including to the lower lakes in South Australia, where most of the so-called environmental flows are basically being flushed into the ocean for no good reason, based on bad science. The first video is about the human cost for farmers, suicides in farming districts, people going to the wall, farm valuations which are less than the value of the debt that they have. And this is a man-made drought, as he points out, because there is water around, but successive governments have nationalised the Murray-Darling. They've handed it over to a Murray-Darling Basin Commission with insane environmental objectives, less and less water available for irrigation. This has nothing to do with climate change, nothing to do with the drought. This is just very, very bad public policy made with no regard for the social and economic costs. So we will link to those videos for and I was going to say, if you have an interest in the Murray-Darling Basin, you've probably already watched it. That we're talking about videos with hundreds of thousands of views. But even if you don't, then you definitely need to look at it, because this is an issue for Australia, not just for the people that are reliant on those water supplies.
I want to point something out slightly tangential. Topher's work is consistently excellent, but what I'm really excited by is something that Topher represents, which is the move in the libertarian community, in the classical liberal, in the conservative community, to pushing out cultural content on YouTube, on videos, obviously the podcasts and all the work that the IPA has been doing. But it's a really important change in the output of the freedom movement, and I'm glad that he's had the opportunity to tackle what is a sleeper of a topic. And certainly in inner city Melbourne, it's easy to ignore the Murray-Darling Basin Commission disaster. But
well said. Yeah, 20 years ago, someone like Topher would have had to have made a video and try to get it picked up by the ABC or someone, but, and that would have been the end of it. Now he's, cumulatively, it must be well over 500,000 views on Facebook. So,
well, I'm going to go on a tangent from there, because the Murray-Darling issue is ultimately a constitutional issue. It comes back to a debate in the constitutional debates where they were trying to give, New South Wales was trying to force a clause that would give each of the states involved in the Murray-Darling Basin use of their own water, and not give that power over to the federal government. But someone inserted the word reasonable before use, and that put it over to the lawyers, and it all went to hell in a handbasket. So I've been reading this article called Dished Like a Dinner by the Victorians, written by Paul Strangio in the Australian Journal of Politics and History. And it's an article about the sort of backroom deal that ensured that the Parliament would sit in Melbourne after 1901, after Federation, but that Canberra, that the ACT would ultimately be within the territory of New South Wales, but 100 miles from Sydney. It's sort of a pet issue of mine. I talk about it in my book on Sir Joseph Carruthers, that it's basically this Pyrrhic victory that George Reid negotiated to try to get the capital site in New South Wales. But by the time Canberra was built and they moved the parliament there in 1927, all the damage had been done. And this article is sort of talking about...
Is this a blame Victoria thing?
It's not a blame Victoria thing. I would connect it to our colleague's recent article on the Canberra swamp and how you have this sort of political culture in Canberra, the Canberra bubble, that really influences what sort of policies get thought up, what policies get talked about. We also have a great deal of regionalism being talked about in the post-federal election with sort of Quexit and people wanting to get rid of Queensland because they actually have decent Australian mainstream values.
Here.
But so the article is exploring the extent to which all the competitive advantages that Victoria had in those first couple of decades by hosting the parliament really contributed to how politics developed. So obviously, protectionism won in the first decade of Australian politics. That was the main fight that was going on between the free traders and the protectionists. Well, the protectionists had things like the fact that it was sitting literally in Victorian Parliament. So Alfred Deakin had offices around the corner. George Reid, the opposition leader for the majority of the first decade, couldn't even attend Parliament half the time because they didn't give the opposition leader an allowance and he didn't get paid enough to even attend Parliament. You had the Age completely dominating the press gallery, and all these sorts of things really contributed to the extent to which protectionism won out ultimately in those early debates. And it was an incredible disappointment to the majority of the country. So in the first decade of Australian politics, both WA, New South Wales and Queensland all had state premiers, at least internally, because I've seen the secret documents with New South Wales and Queensland, talking about secession and getting out of federation because basically it was all for Victoria. And the only people that were happy with federation were Victoria and its appendages in South Australia and Tasmania.
Wow.
You just wanted to
Not to
attack
offend
me.
any South Australians or Tasmanians who happen to be listening.
No, it is fascinating. And I did pen a little piece for the IPA a long time ago when I was asked to nominate Australia's greatest mistakes, and I nominated Canberra. And I must admit, even as someone who's deeply suspicious of New South Welshmen and their idea that Sydney would have made a great capital for the country, I actually said that Canberra had been such a disaster that I even would have preferred Sydney, just because a capital should be in a real city.
No, it should be. It should be near the the financial
Commerce
centers of power,
and the
commerce,
arts.
and it's not about the politicians; it's about the bureaucrats. And so I think I look forward to reading the piece. But I think what's interesting is the real damage that Canberra has done has been not where Parliament is, because politicians don't get out very much when they're in Parliament anyway. The real damage has been the fact that the bureaucracy is by itself in a centre of power, unconnected to the rest of the economy. So when it chooses to do these petty regulations, when it chooses to control and intervene in the economy, it's controlling and intervening in an economy that it is a very long away from.
It's also created a really noticeable class of elites. I mean, public sector public service salaries, especially at senior levels, are obscenely high. Now, when I worked for an MP when I was a kid, I was 21 or something, and when I went up then, it was 2008. There was a pub, a Chinese restaurant on the airport. It was, a sleepy little town. When I went back later to work as a ministerial staffer, less than, about 5, 6, 7 years later, there were bars and restaurants and cafes, and it had turned into this glittering, almost like a mini Washington DC. It had grown so fat off the largesse and the expansion of the public service in the Rudd and Gillard years. As a staffer, I thought it was great because there were places to go and eat and drink and let your hair down after a long day. But as a Liberal, I found it absolutely horrifying, this glittering city that has grown off the excesses of our stolen money.
And I think the other thing is that we also just want a federation that's small enough that it doesn't really matter where Canberra is or whatever the ACT, the sort of where Parliament is going to sit. We sort of tend to underplay the regional differences in Australia, but I think we have huge regional differences as far as political culture is concerned. That's always been the case. The recent election has emphasised that. And I think that strengthening federation and strengthening the extent to which each of the states can look after their own affairs would really improve the political situation.
Preaching to the choir there, mate. You're on the Looking Forward podcast. We like a bit of argument, but you're not going to get much on that one. So, yes, you have been listening to the Looking Forward, a product of the Institute of Public Affairs. As I mentioned, we currently have our end of financial appeal running. If you want to reduce your taxable income, send some our way and we'll look after you. You can also join as a member and receive many great products, including the IPA review and advanced notice of events and all sorts of cool things. A big thank you to our panellists today, Dr. Chris Berg,
Thanks, Scott.
Gideon Rosner,
Thank you.
and Zach Gorman.
Cheers.
And of course, as always, a big thank you to our producer, James Bolt. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.